All right, we're about ready to get started. Thank you all for coming out tonight to the activity that we're having to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Tonight we have a very distinguished guest speaker from the University of Kentucky, Dr. Gerald Smith. So I want to make just a few announcements. I'm Dr. Sharon Austin, the director of the African American Studies program and also associate professor of political science. But I want to first of all mention our co-sponsors. Before I forget, I want to thank the Graham Center, Gail and David Coburn, Shelby Taylor for allowing us to use the Ocora tonight and also for all their assistance in promoting the event. And I also want to make just a few suggestions to you. First of all, I want to say I'm very glad to see that all of you came out. If you're here to sign in for a class, there are sign-in sheets at the back table. Sharon, if you could hold your hand up, where Miss Burney is standing. So if you're here getting extra credit for my class or for any of your other classes, Miss Burney has a sign-in sheet. Please turn off your cell phones, or at least mute your cell phones. At the end of the program, we'll have a question and answer session in which you'll be allowed to ask Dr. Smith some questions. We ask that you come to the microphone because we are streaming this and we are recording this program. So we'll have microphones down front if you have any questions for our speaker when he finishes his lecture. I want to say a few things also about some upcoming activities, one in particular that we have in the African American Studies program. Every year we have something called the Ronald Foreman Lecture, which is named after the first director of the African American Studies program, Dr. Ronald Foreman, who was director from 1970 until 2000. And this year on February 8th, we have some flyers in the back, but at 6 o'clock p.m., February 8th, which is a Thursday, we'll be hosting Dr. Miriam Harris of Macalester College. Her grandmother's name is Miriam Mann, and her grandmother was one of the first black women to work at NASA. If any of you saw the film Hidden Figures, she was a consultant for that film, and her grandmother was one of the women who was the first to integrate NASA. And so she'll be talking about a book that she wrote entitled Human Hidden Computers, in which she talks about her grandmother's experiences and those of other African-American women who were the first to integrate NASA. So if any of you are interested, again, that'll be Thursday, February 8th at 6 o'clock p.m., and that'll be in Smathers Library, room 100, and we have some flyers in the back. I want to introduce the person who will be introducing our speaker, because one of the things that we've started doing is allowing people to see the talent of our students who are in our major or our minor. So tonight, one of our very talented students is going to come. I want to just give you a brief description of who she is, and she will be introducing our speaker, Dr. Gerald Smith, and then when he finishes, you'll be able to come down to ask questions. So I want to introduce Bahasi Coleman Chapman. Chapman. She's a junior here at the University of Florida. Because of her passion for social justice, she has a double major in African American Studies and Criminology, as well as a minor in theater. She is also a volunteer ambassador for the Black Affairs Department under Multicultural and Diversity Affairs. So she will now come forward and introduce our speaker, Dr. Gerald Smith. It's real loud, so hold it down. Okay, it's on the front and the back.
Dr. Gerald L. Smith is a native of Lexington, Kentucky. He earned his BA, MA, and PhD degrees from the University of Kentucky in history. Currently, he is a full professor of history and is a former holder of both the Theodore A. Hallam Professorship and the Martin Luther King Center Scholar in Residence at the University of Kentucky. From 1997 to 2005, he served as the director of the African American Studies and Research Program at UK. Dr. Smith is the author, editor, or co-editor of 4 books. He has more than 40 articles, essays, and book reviews published in historical journals and encyclopedias. He served as a keynote speaker for numerous programs, consulted on various historical projects, lectured on college campuses around the state, and conducted workshops for primary and secondary school teachers. He has appeared in historical documentaries which have aired on CBS, NBC, KET, the CBS Sports Network, and True TV. Dr. Smith is a co-editor of the award-winning Kentucky African American Encyclopedia and is currently writing a new general history on Kentucky African Americans. His awards include Selection as a National Faculty Scholar, Who's Who Among African Americans, Induction into the Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, the Evelyn Black Award from the UK Black Student Union in both 2005 and 2017, a 2006 inductee into the Henry Clay High School Hall of Fame in Lexington, Kentucky, and several other awards. In 2014, the Commonwealth of Kentucky's Personal Cabinet presented him with the annual Charles W. Anderson Laureate Medal Award, its highest award given to individuals recognized for significant contributions to equal opportunity in their communities. Finally, he was named a recipient of the 2016 Living Legacy Award during the 13th annual Black History Month celebration at the Kentucky State Capitol in Frankfort, Kentucky, and was recognized as the Outstanding Professor by Fraternity and Sorority Greek Life at the University of Kentucky in 2017. Dr. Smith is also the pastor of Pilgrim Baptist Church in Lexington, Kentucky. He's married to the former Teresa Turner. They are the parents of 2 daughters. Please welcome Dr. Gerald L. Smith.
Good evening. Feel better already. I was looking for my phone, and it's up here, so okay. We can continue now. I am truly honored and humbled by this invitation to come and lecture this evening on Dr. King's life. I want to thank Dr. Austin for the invitation and gracious hospitality that I've received here, and been a pleasure meeting Dean Richardson, those with the Graham Center and the Oral History Program, and the students we've met so far. I know some of you are here because of course grade, and that's what we do. But I hope in the process you learn something, and that you don't go to sleep too soon. Stay with me. It's like a story of a man who was speaking one evening, and he had spoken for about 2 hours. And after 2 hours, he called out to the sound technician and said, "Mr. Sound Man, turn up the volume. I can't hear myself." Person on the front row said, "That's all right. You ain't talking about anything anyway. So I hope y'all don't feel that way." He said, "He ain't talking about nothing." So I hope we have something to say. I have a manuscript that I'm going to share because I have several extensive quotes that I want to offer tonight regarding King's life, and I've titled Rediscovering the Committed Life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Rediscovering the Committed Life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. In January 1985, Mrs. Coretta Scott King called Claiborne Carson, and that's his picture on the front, Claiborne Carson, who was a history professor at Stanford University, to inquire of his interest in becoming the senior editor of the proposed multi-volume Papers of the Martin Luther King, Jr. project. Carson accepted the position, and during the course of his work, learned that there were King-related documents in Mrs. King's basement. In March of 1997, Carson, his wife, and assistant visited Mrs. King's home at 234 Sunset Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. Carson recalls the visit in his book, Martin's Dream, My Journey and the Legacy of Martin Luther King. He writes that Mrs. King's personal aide greeted them and escorted them to the King's study, where they observed Dr. King's personal library of books. They were then taken to the basement, where there were boxes of never-before-seen King files. Carson recalled seeing a large olive green box and about the size of a normal banker's box. Inside were more than 200 folders which consisted of outlines, drafts, and texts of King's sermons. These files would become known as the sermon box. King had mentioned that such a file existed in a letter that he had written to Coretta while he was in the Georgia State Prison in Reidsville, Georgia. In October of 1960, he wrote a letter to Coretta asking her to bring him several books along with, quote, sermons from my file. The acquisition of the sermon materials, among a few other personal papers, would prove to be a major find in rediscovering the committed life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The documents in the sermon box would reveal King's ability to interlace biblical texts, literature, Christian hymns, philosophy, contemporary news, as well as ideas from other ministers into a coherent sermon that granted his listeners both comfort and courage in the midst of fierce racist opposition. It was apparent that King would draw upon psychology and sociology as well as the sermons of white Protestant ministers to jumpstart his sermons. He found these sources useful in articulating the needs and concerns of the African American community. A few years before the sermon box was located, I met Professor Carson while I was teaching at Memphis State University. It was during the spring semester of 1993 when Carson extended me the opportunity to work with the King Papers Project as a contributing volume editor. I appreciated the opportunity but declined the invitation. At the time, I was completing a book manuscript and in the early stages of another research project. However, by the fall of 1997, much had changed in my professional and personal life. I was a member of the history faculty at UK and director of the African American Studies and Research program. The year before, I had announced my own call to the ministry, and at the time was an associate minister in my own church. In planning the calendar for African American Studies, I called Professor Carson to invite him to speak at UK in commemoration of the 30th anniversary of Dr. King's death. As we renewed our acquaintance, I informed him that I was now a licensed minister. Clay then said these exact words, "How fortuitous." He proceeded to share with me how the project had recently acquired Dr. King's sermon files. He asked if I would like to be a co-editor on this volume. Somewhat awed by the opportunity, I accepted the offer and recruited one of my UK graduate students named Troy Jackson to work with me. Troy had a master's degree from Princeton and pastored a Christian church in Cincinnati. He would eventually earn his master's and PhD degrees at UK, serve as a co-editor of the papers, and publish a book titled Becoming King, which examined how King's years in Montgomery shaped him into a national leader. Like many historians, I was familiar with the basics surrounding King's life and philosophy of nonviolence. I was aware of the commitment and courage and leadership that he provided to the Black freedom struggle. I was familiar with his gifted oratorical skills, but I did not realize how much his preaching ministry influenced his role as a civil rights leader. Between 1998 and 2005, Troy Jackson and I traveled to Stanford University, mostly during the summer months, but occasionally at other times of the year for joint editorial meetings with Clay Carson, his wife Susan, and Sue Englander, who were both on the staff at the project. In 2007, the papers of Martin Luther King, Jr., Advocate of the Social Gospel, Volume 6, was published by the University of California Press. Carson would later write in his own memoir that, quote, "The newly found documents revealed that once King arrived in Montgomery and was thrust into his leadership role, his religious convictions served as a foundation for his civil rights activism," end quote. As we reflect on King's life, I believe it is critically important to explore his preaching ministry as a means of understanding his commitment to social justice in the face of the hatred and harassment he encountered throughout the 1960s. For King, the ministry began on a Sunday afternoon in the fall of 1947. A large crowd gathered in the basement of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, for his trial sermon. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., better known as Daddy King, was the pastor of Ebenezer. Realizing the basement would not hold the size of the crowd wanting to hear his son preach, Daddy King then moved the special services to Ebenezer's main sanctuary. 18-year-old Martin, known to family and friends as ML, then preached his first sermon, believed to be titled, "Life is What You Make It." His message was well received by the congregation, and upon his father's recommendation, he was licensed to preach the gospel. In the words of his father, quote, M.L. had found himself. On February the 25th of 1948, King was examined by a committee of ministers on his Christian beliefs and ordained a Baptist minister. He was appointed by his father as associate pastor of Ebenezer. King would later write that his call to the ministry was, quote, neither dramatic nor spectacular. It came neither by some miraculous vision nor by some blinding light experience on the road of life. Moreover, it was a response to an inner urge that gradually came upon me. This urge expressed itself in a desire to serve God and humanity, and the feeling that my talent and commitment could best be expressed through ministry. I came to see that God had placed a responsibility upon my shoulders, and the more I tried to escape it, the more frustrated I would become, end quote. Throughout his life, Martin King had been an observer and a participant of the African American religious experience. He was familiar with the songs, traditions, and the significance of the church in the community. He had grown up listening to black preachers, including his father. Daddy King was a fiery preacher who believed preaching should be emotional. Martin had heard the cadences, the rhythms, illustrations, the metaphors, biblical passages commonly expressed by black preachers. Yet he was also exposed to a diversity of black preaching styles that included Benjamin Mays, president of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard University, and William Holmes Border, the pastor of Atlanta's Wheat Street Baptist Church, as well as numerous other pastors. In their own way, each shaped King's homiletical preparation in a manner that he would use throughout his preaching and public ministry. Examining King's ministry is important for understanding the theological and philosophical underpinnings of his life's work. To be sure, King's years at Morehouse were significant, shaping his religious ideology. President Mays addressed the students each Tuesday and stressed the importance of academic excellence and community service. King remembered his professor of religion, George Kelsey, and found him most interesting because he offered an open discussion of the Bible, which differed from his father, who espoused a literal interpretation of the Bible. King graduated from Morehouse in 1948, and at the age of 19 began his first semester at Crozier Theological Seminary near Chester, Pennsylvania. He was one of the 11 black students on campus. He began his studies with a determined and disciplined attitude. If I were a minute late to class, King would later write, I was almost morbidly conscious of it and sure that everyone noticed it. Rather than be thought of as always laughing, I'm afraid I was grimly serious for a time. I had a tendency to overdress, to keep my room spotless, my shoes perfectly shined, and my clothes immaculately pressed, end quote. King was no doubt aware of the many stereotypes that have been ascribed to African Americans. At Crozier, King read on a regular basis and wrote papers on a range of religious topics. For a course on the preaching ministry, King prepared an outline essay titled Preaching Ministry. King wrote that, quote, the minister must be sincere and intelligent. Too often do our ministers possess the former but not the latter. This, I think, is a serious problem facing the ministry. I think preaching should grow out of the experiences of the people. Therefore, I, as a minister, must know the problems of the people that I am pastoring. According to King, the preaching ministry was a dual process. Quote, on the one hand, I must attempt to change the soul of individuals so that their societies may be changed. And on the other, I must attempt to change the society so that the individual soul will have a change. This philosophy guided King's public and preaching ministry throughout the 1950s and 60s. King graduated from Crozier in 1951 and matriculated at Boston University, where he studied for a PhD degree in theology. In the spring of 1952, King began dating a young woman named Coretta Scott. Miss Scott was born in near Marion, Alabama. Her parents owned a farm and were determined to give their children the best education they could afford. Coretta had studied music and eventually enrolled in Boston's New England Conservatory of Music. Her friend Mary Powell introduced her to King, who was a doctoral candidate at Boston University. Coretta was impressed with his intelligence and charm. That summer, Coretta was in Boston, while King returned to Ebenezer to serve as an associate pastor under his father. On July the 18th of 1952, King wrote a letter to Coretta that I believe serves as the most prophetic and insightful document to shed light on his committed life. This particular letter had been in Mrs. King's personal collection for many years until it was published in Volume 6 of the King Papers. To place the letter in context, understand that King was upset with Coretta since she had implied in an earlier correspondence that she was not planning to stay with the King family during her visit to Atlanta. In his letter, July 18, 1952, King expressed his disappointment, but then went on to let her know how much he missed her. He wrote, "My love for you is based on a solid foundation that the stormy winds of anger cannot blow asunder. My life without you is like a year without springtime. Can you imagine the frustration that a king without a throne would face?" And then King wrote, "Oh, excuse me, my darling. I didn't mean to go off on such a poetical and romantic flight." In this same letter, King noted how he had just finished reading a novel by Edward Bellamy titled Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, which talked about a classless society. Then King, as he closed out his 1952 letter, wrote these words: "Let us continue to work, hope, and pray that we will live to see a warless world, a redistribution of wealth, and a brotherhood that transcends race or color. This is the gospel that I will preach to the world." End quote. This mission, this dream, this gospel would lead to a path of tremendous peril and personal sacrifice. King would encounter physical attacks and verbal assaults. He would have his share of enemies and distractors, both inside and outside the movement. On January the 30th of 1956, a bomb was placed on his front porch during the Montgomery bus boycott. On September the 4th of 1958, he was arrested for loitering while standing outside a courtroom in Montgomery. On September the 20th of 1958, King was in a bookstore in Harlem signing copies of his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, when a then 42-year-old demented African-American woman named Azola Curry stabbed him in the upper left side of his chest. The doctor said if he had sneezed or coughed, the Japanese penknife would have ruptured his aorta. In September of 1962, King was speaking at the annual meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Birmingham, Alabama, when a 6'2" white man weighing 200 pounds named Roy James of the Nazi Party rushed to the stage, punching King in the face, then continuously striking him. King looked at his attacker in the face and did not strike back. Though he was bleeding, King told those around him, "Don't touch him. We have to pray for him." During the course of King's activism, he faced numerous death threats. He even admitted, "I went to bed many nights scared to death." To be sure, King was most doggedly harassed by the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was obsessed with the idea that communists had infiltrated the civil rights movement and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in particular. King was president of the SCLC, which he and other ministers had founded to coordinate local movements in 1957. Hoover's intent on destroying King and the freedom movement intensified following the 1963 March on Washington. He launched a full surveillance attack on persons engaged in the civil rights activities. More specifically, the FBI actively engaged in a counterintelligence program, better known as COINTELPRO, to, quote, expose, disrupt, or otherwise neutralize members of the Communist Party. By October of 1963, Hoover had convinced Attorney General Robert Kennedy to authorize the wiretapings of King's home, as well as SCLC offices in Atlanta and New York. William Sullivan of the FBI's Domestic Intelligence Division proposed infiltrating, quote, King's office with colored agents, or perhaps a good-looking female plant, and to employ specialized investigative techniques at the SCLC's offices, end quote. Hoover, racist in his attitudes toward King, would refer to King as, quote, a burrhead, and later on as, quote, a tomcat with obsessive, degenerate sexual urges. In 1963, the year that King was selected Time Man of the Year, Hoover said, quote, they had to dig deep in the garbage for this one. SCLC leaders were aware that FBI agents were placing microphone surveillances in their hotel rooms. Andrew Young recalled that the hotel parking lots would, quote, have these little plain green Plymouths with two-way radios in them. Sullivan and Cartha DeLoach of the Crime Records Division of the Bureau collected information from bugged rooms, hoping to tarnish King's image among his supporters. Information was then leaked to labor leaders, foundation trustees, university leaders, with the intent to discredit King's leadership. There was no evidence of communist infiltration, but the Bureau did make a strong case that King was linked to adulterous activity. Hoover's disdain and resentment of King mounted even more when King criticized the FBI's Southern agents, who he said were, quote, friendly with the local police and people who were promoting segregation. Every time I saw an FBI man in Albany, said King, they were with the local police force. Hoover would later call King, quote, the most notorious liar in the country. In the fall of 1964, the Domestic Intelligence Division produced a tape of activities from a Willard hotel room in Washington, D.C., where King had stayed. The tape was described as the highlights of wiretapes of, quote, dirty jokes and bawdy remarks, plus the sounds of people having sex. The tape was packaged and accompanied with a distressing note written by William Sullivan to King, pressuring him to commit suicide. In part, the note read, quote, King, look into your heart. You know you are a complete fraud and a great liability to Negroes. King, like all frauds, your end is approaching. You could have been our greatest leader, but you are done. No person can overcome the facts. The American public, the church, organizations that have been helping Protestant, Catholic, and Jews will know you for what you are. So will others who have backed you. You are done. There's only one thing left for you to do. There's but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. The package was mailed to the SCLC office in Atlanta on November the 24th, 1964. It wasn't opened until a couple of months later by Coretta on January the 5th, who listened to part of the tape and described it as just a lot of mumbo jumbo. The plan did not work, and despite the efforts to use the tape to bring King down, there was little interest from newspaper reporters. On April the 4th of 1967, King publicly denounced America's involvement in the Vietnam War in a speech at Riverside Church in New York. This speech was interpreted by the FBI as, quote, proof that King had been influenced by communist advisors. In the summer of 1967, the FBI's COINTELPRO on black nationalist hate groups, which included a focus on King, who the Bureau considered a serious threat, able to unite black nationalists. It is within this historical context that King never strayed from his message. Despite the harassment he encountered from the FBI, the opposition he faced from other black leaders for his decision to speak against America's involvement in the Vietnam War, King's commitment to work, hope, and pray, to live to see a warless world, a redistribution of wealth, and a brotherhood that transcended race and color remained central to his life. Early on, King believed in the social gospel, which was a social reform movement led by American Protestants to address the ills of industrialization, immigration, and urbanization by seeking to meet the physical and spiritual needs of individuals. For King, this was the primary mission he had to engage in as a preacher. The sermon box, discovered nearly 30 years after King's assassination, consisted of the sermons King preached while he served as pastor of Dexter from 1954 to 1959. The sermons were in various stages of development. A few were completed manuscripts. Others were in draft form or merely outlines of his sermonic ideas. Rarely were any of his early sermons more than 3 or 4 written pages. Most of the sermons included an introduction and 2 or 3 points. King was a student of the Bible with the gift to memorize poems, hymns, and philosophical quotations that added to the quality of his messages. He was a gifted preacher who worked extremely hard early in his ministry, developed his craft, and shaped it into a language the world could understand and appreciate. King approached his pastoral duties with confidence and conviction. He even maintained detailed records of his pastoral activities. For instance, during his first year as pastor of Dexter, he preached 46 times, conducted 87 pastoral visits, baptized 12 new members, performed 5 marriages, preached 5 funerals, dedicated 2 children, and read 26 books. Members of Dexter held fond memories of their young pastor. According to Dorothy Posey, listeners could not go to sleep on Reverend King. He kept everybody's attention. A listener never lost his or her train of thought because Reverend King never abandoned his train of thought. There have been excellent works to explore King's preaching. English professor Keith Miller has written a study titled Voice of Deliverance, the language of Martin Luther King Jr. and its sources. Through meticulous research, Miller notes that King was influenced by white theologians in the black folk pulpit. He argues that King borrowed sermons from white preachers and preached sermons without acknowledging the source. Voice merging, writes Miller, enabled King to borrow sermons and skillfully intertwine his language and his identity with those of his sources. But Miller suggested that voice merging and borrowing are very much a part of the art of folk preaching. Miller also noted that King, quote, often borrowed from himself, moving material freely from speeches to sermons and sermons to speeches. While researching Volume 1 of the Papers of Martin Luther King Jr., researchers at the King Papers Project very early on recognized and discovered that King had plagiarized passages of his dissertation, borrowing passages from a student who had finished his doctorate at Crozier just a few years earlier. Carson concluded that King's, quote, seriously flawed writings increased his awareness of modern theological and philosophical ideas and prepared him for his subsequent role as a black leader capable of influencing white as well as black Americans. Actually, King was no different from other ministers. According to Michael Eric Dyson in his book, I May Not Get There With You, The True Martin Luther King Jr., there is a 3-step rhetorical rule of citation by which many black Baptist preachers operate. The first time they repeat something they hear, they say, like, quote, like Martin Luther King said. The second time they repeat it, they say, like somebody said. The third time they repeat it, they say, like I always say. As Dyson, who was also an ordained African-American preacher, notes, black preachers coin phrases, stack sentences, and accumulate wise sayings and borrow speech to convene to black folk, as the gospel song says, to run to see what the end is going to be. Keith Miller and Michael Dyson are not the only scholars in recent years to write about King's preaching. Another book on the subject is The Preacher King by Richard Letcher. His book offers an examination of King's religious background and beliefs in order to explain how it transferred to his commitment to resolving social and political problems in America. Like Miller, Letcher highlights the significance of King's seminary training, particularly his exposure to white intellectuals like Henry David Thoreau, Reinhold Niebuhr, and Paul Tillich. But Letcher argues that King's collection of sermons in the 1963 book, titled Strength to Love, were edited to the extent that the voice of King is lost. Letcher writes, anything resembling the African-American gospel in which King was nurtured or the prophetic rays that often seized him was removed in order to lend his utterances universality and to recommend his movements to a wide reading audience as possible. In the process, continued Letcher, his real preaching and consequently something of the real Martin Luther King Jr. was lost to the public. The earliest available tape recording of King's preaching dates back to February the 28th, 1954. King preached a sermon titled Rediscovering Lost Values at the Second Baptist Church in Detroit. King drew upon the Gospel according to St. Luke, chapter 2, verses 41 to 52 as his text. The text cites Joseph and Mary went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover and took Jesus with them. And after a few days, they left to return to Nazareth. But after a day's journey, they realized Jesus was missing. So they had to return to Jerusalem because they recognized that Jesus had been left behind. King told churchgoers, quote, if we are to go forward, if we are to make a better world in which to live, we have to go back. We have got to rediscover the precious values that we've left behind. The trouble isn't so much that we don't know enough, but it's as if we aren't good enough. The trouble isn't so much that our scientific genius lags behind, but our moral genius lags behind. The great problem facing modern man is that the means by which we live have outdistanced the spiritual ends for which we live. So we find ourselves caught in a messed up world. King then highlighted two precious values society had left behind. The first is that all reality hinges on moral foundations. And second is that all reality has spiritual control. In other words, we've got to go back and rediscover the principle that there is a God behind the process. We must remember, continued King, that it is possible to affirm the existences of God with your lips and to deny his existence with your life. King preached, quote, the most dangerous type of atheism is not theoretical atheism, but practical atheism. That's the most dangerous type. And the world, even the church, is filled up with people who pay lip service to God and not life service, end quote. In December of 1955, King's preaching ministry would become even more pronounced. On a Thursday evening, December the 1st, in Montgomery, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat to a white passenger on the Cleveland Avenue bus. Parks had violated segregated seating policy for public transportation, refusing to surrender her seat to a white passenger. An organization of black women, the Women's Political Council, took up the call to lead a boycott of city buses. King was subsequently elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. The organization then coordinated a citywide protest. But each week, King would preach before the congregation of Dexter, a message of hope, faith, and good over evil. On December the 4th of 1955, the day before that boycott was to begin, he preached, "Why does God hide himself?" King acknowledged attention to the awful silence of heaven in the face of evil. 4 weeks into the boycott, he preached, "Our God is able." He said, "There are times that I get despondent and wonder if it's worth it. But then something says to me deep down within, God is able. You need not worry." 6 weeks into the movement, he preached how to believe in a good God in the midst of glaring evil. And on January the 30th of 1956, King, while speaking at the First Baptist Church there in Montgomery, was called home once he had learned his home had been bombed. He rushed home and encouraged everyone to remain nonviolent. That next Sunday, February the 5th, King preached, "It's hard to be a Christian." For 381 days, blacks carpooled or walked to reach their place of destination. The boycott ended with a Supreme Court decision outlawing racial seating on local transportation in Alabama. Following the boycott, King emerged as a national leader. As a Christian minister, he challenged the church to be a strong advocate of racial equality. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, King wrote, "In the midst of blatant injustices afflicted upon the Negro, I have watched the white churchmen stand on the sidelines and mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities." King once again confronted the church in a sermon titled "A Knock at Midnight," noting that if the church does not participate actively in the struggle for peace and for economic and racial justice, it will, said King, forfeit the loyalty of millions and cause men everywhere to say that it has atrophied its will. It was during the Montgomery bus boycott that the FBI began to first monitor King. This surveillance was part of its Racial Matters program that targeted organizations and individuals engaged in issues involving race and politics. By the mid-1960s, King was moving beyond issues of segregation and voting in the South to national human rights issues. He targeted slum housing conditions in the North, discriminatory lending policies among banks, poverty, and, of course, America's involvement in the Vietnam War. In the process, 63% of white Americans had an unfavorable opinion of him in 1966. During the year of his assassination, King was no longer included in the Gallup poll that represented the 10 most respected persons in the United States. Meanwhile, the movement had become fractured between his philosophy of nonviolent direct action and African Americans wielding a more black nationalist vision. Throughout the last 5 years of King's life, the FBI had increased its monitoring activities of him, accusing him of misusing funds and fostering damaging information involving his sexual relations with women. Yet perhaps even more distressing was the Bureau's failure to notify King and his staff of the threats against his life. This fact enhanced suspicion that his assassination was part of a government conspiracy. Immediately after King's death was announced, on April the 4th of 1968, Attorney General Ramsey Clark called the then Assistant Director of the FBI, Cartha DeLoach, informing him that the FBI should investigate. Ramsey Clark had drew up on a U.S. code which prohibited conspiracies to injure, oppress, or threaten or intimidate any citizen in the free exercise or enjoyment of their rights under the Constitution. DeLoach then called Hoover and recalled that conversation. DeLoach said, quote, "Some idiot shot Martin Luther King." Hoover responded, "Do not accept responsibility for this investigation. This is a local matter. Offer Memphis whatever help they need, ballistics, fingerprints, criminal records, but this case falls under the jurisdiction of city and state police." Once DeLoach explained to the Attorney General the position, once DeLoach explained to Hoover the position of the Attorney General, then Hoover conceded. There was no doubt that the FBI had to take up the charge. It was a case of, quote, immense importance to the nation. "Okay, go ahead," said Hoover, "but I want you to take charge. You make it clear that this is the FBI's case." 3,500 FBI agents were on the case to capture King's assassin. It cost the government nearly $2 million to find James Earl Ray. Ramsey Clark said that the FBI's reputation was at stake. When King was assassinated on that Thursday evening, the FBI conducted one of its most intensive investigations, a murder which ended up with the conviction of a 40-year-old white man by the name of James Earl Ray. Ray would declare his innocence all the way until he died in April of 1998. A House Select Committee on Assassinations and a Justice Department investigation did not refute the evidence against Ray. Nevertheless, King's son, Dexter, maintained his belief in Ray's innocence as rumors and questions continued to circulate about King's murderer. As we approach the 50th anniversary of King's death, there is sure to be much discussion about the role of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, United States Army Special Forces, the Mafia. There'll be plenty of panel discussions about the FBI and even the Memphis Police and the Memphis Fire Department, as well as other conspiracies regarding his death. King's last speech, in which he proclaimed, "I've been to the mountaintop and seen the promised land," will clearly and rightfully provide an emotional backdrop to this exploration of history. In 1998, the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice investigated two separate findings surrounding King's assassination. One was an allegation made by Lloyd Jowers, who owned a Memphis grill in the building where Ray fired the shot to kill King. Jowers claimed that he had hired a hitman and the shot was fired from the back of his establishment. But a lack of evidence and Jowers' conflicting statements and his attempt to profit from his testimony undercut his admission. The second allegation involved FBI agent Donald Wilson, who claimed that he took documents from Ray's abandoned car, which had been found in Atlanta after the killing. Two documents included the name Raul, the person Ray said had framed him for King's death. Wilson's own inconsistent statements and the lack of credible evidence dismissed this conspiracy. There will always be questions about King's death, but there is no question about his life. Exactly 2 months before his assassination, King preached one of his most famous sermons titled "The Drum Major Instinct." And in that sermon, he declared that he just wanted to leave a committed life behind. The July 18, 1952 letter to Coretta and the sermon box allows us to rediscover this committed life and his fight against poverty, injustice, police brutality, housing disparities, and war. Long before the letter from a Birmingham jail, the "I Have a Dream" speech, or the Beyond Vietnam speech, King had a declared and determined vision for America that was deeply expressed through his faith. In King's own words, quote, "Before I was a civil rights leader, I was a preacher of the gospel. This was my first calling, and yet remains my greatest commitment." Thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Okay. Hey, it's too hot. Thank you for coming to Gainesville. I hope you're not overwhelmed by the excitement. Seriously, I hope your hosts show you something special here, like the play downtown tonight at the Hippodrome or the Show Colored Museum here on campus. But my question very quickly, I'm so glad you're a minister, as my question goes partly to MLK's pastoral speaking style as related to the 1963 speech in D.C., mistitled "I Have a Dream." It's said that Mahalia Jackson, as a close bystander that day, repeatedly told him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin," so the speech as originally cast would not even have featured the dream idea. 13 times or so in the first part of the speech, he made economic references like the uncashed check and not sufficient funds in the Bank of Liberty. Perhaps he knew of the scholarship value in slave labor just from 1790 to 1862 at over $17 trillion. So it's really the "I have a marker" speech, and he should be called the creditor, not the dreamer. He was about economic justice, not sleeping. But after his removal, the movement went to sleep, content with the baby step of school desegregation. So it never became true integration, and it never moved to the real boulder, housing desegregation.
If you have a question, that's what we are looking for is questions.
Just kind of respond to that. The night he stayed up to 4 o'clock in the morning working on that speech. He had several advisors working with him as well. And he had made reference. Is my mic on? Okay. So he stayed up to 4 o'clock in the morning. Let me come down. I just read. I don't preach with a manuscript, thank God. And I don't teach with a manuscript, but I had so many quotes I had to go with a manuscript. So that's not my style. But anyway, so King stays up to 4 o'clock in the morning working on that speech, staying in the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. And he had asked several of his advisors to kind of give him some working themes. The idea of a dream did come up in that working session because King had made reference to I Have a Dream going back as early as we know as 1962. And so in many respects, when we hear the I Have a Dream speech, it's another case in which he is recycling something that he's done before. And in fact, the originality of the I Have a Dream speech is, actually, goes back even earlier than that. He's heard it in other places, so he's borrowed it and he's brought it into his speech. The original title of the I Have a Dream speech was supposed to be titled Normalcy Never Again. You see how we would remember that? I don't think so. That was the original title. And so, he stands and he begins. So for the first, initially, he's supposed to only speak 5 minutes. And, everybody else wanted to be up front, at the front of the program. You don't want to be the last speaker. You want to be the first speaker. Because if you're the last speaker, by that time, everybody's leaving. People are not paying attention. You've been out here all day. It's hot. It's time to go. Because they wanted to be there. The other speakers wanted to be ahead of him because they wanted to be present when all the media was there. Because the 6 o'clock news had to come on. They had to get the tape back to the stations and run it. So King goes last. All right. For the first 10 minutes of that speech, he has a manuscript. And he's reading. If you watch it, he's reading from that manuscript. The other thing you've got to realize, too, is that he's nervous. If he's in 1963, he gives 350 speeches. He travels, hundreds of miles around the country. He's tired. It's wearing on him. And so he's speaking. And so, you do hear him say, tell him about the dream, tell him about the dream. But what you don't hear is somebody else saying, F the dream, as he's going. You don't pick that up on, when you hear about that. But King yet and still, caught up in the spirit and the oratory skills that he had and the set piece. Because, what happens in those kind of moments, he's calling, he's pulling things that he said before because he doesn't have to look down because he's said it so many times. And he believes in it. And so it's about jobs, obviously. It's about freedom. But it's also his way of trying to, quote unquote, redeem the soul of America.
Is there another question?
How many volumes is that?
Right now, started out, the plan was to do 14 volumes. We published volume 6 in 2007. That was just the one. I was in, out. I'm in and out. That was it. But they just, I think last year or year before, completed volume 7. So it takes anywhere from 8 or 9 years just to do one volume. So we started, I started flying back and forth to Stanford in 1998. And it was just crazy, just going out there in the summers. Then the more we worked on the volume, then, it was just periodically 3 or 4 days, through the year. You fly out, you work, we sit in a conference room, we'd work on it away from, obviously, the project, but then we get together as editors, then we go with each line, look at each sermon, and each word, and where does the comma go, where does the period go? Do we know he preached this sermon? Do we know the year when he preached the sermon? How do we know that he preached the sermon? If we don't know, what kind of range are we going to give it? Fortunately, King was the kind of person that saved a lot. Seemed like he saved everything. when I first started working with the project, and then when I went out there that summer of 1998, it just blew me away to have this opportunity to literally, what I said, walk in his academic footsteps. Because he served his syllabi, he saved his syllabi, he saved his papers, he saved his note cards, he saved so much of his life. But what folks did not know, of all the books that were written about Martin Luther King before 2007, no one had ever seen this collection that was in Mrs. King's basement. So what she did is that she gave Clay Carson, who's the senior editor of the project, and without question a renowned historian on King, she gave them access to his personal library. So they inventoried all the books in his personal library. So every book, you know, they had a copy machine there on site, and they made copies of the pages that he had made annotations in, notes, and sometimes he would stick it in a file, but he kept it all in a box. And it was in this box in the basement. It wasn't at the King Center, it wasn't, you know, at Boston University. Obviously they didn't have it at Stanford, they were in her home. And that July 18th, 1952 letter was a letter that was in her home. And which I think is just amazing that he wrote this letter, a personal letter to his girlfriend in 1952 to say, this is the gospel I'm going to preach to the world. And then...
Hi. I'm curious as to when was the moment that you decided that Martin Luther King was the person that you wanted to focus most of your research on? Because I know you mostly focused on the civil rights movement, but how did you decide to specifically talk about Dr. King?
Well, I started teaching a course on civil rights in Memphis in 1989, the spring of 1989. It was an evening course, so I had, you know, mostly adult students, and I was teaching this course on civil rights. I'm living right there in Memphis. The National Civil Rights Museum is being constructed. I mean, you know, go right past the Rain Motel and all of that. And then when Clay extended me this opportunity to work on a project, and given the fact that in my faith that God had literally aligned not only my preaching ministry as well as my role as a professor, then it was just a gift. You know, I mean, I never would have imagined that my scholarship would connect with my ministry in the way that it did. And, you know, I announced my call to preach in 1996. I was licensed in 96, and then, wow, you know, the next year, you know, I'm working on a project, and people would, you know, kind of say, Gerald, how did you get a chance to do that? Well, you know, it was a blessing. You know, and then not only that, but then to the other opportunities that have extended from just working on this volume. You know, in 2000 was Millennium Sunday at King International Chapel at Morehouse. So, and all the civil rights, you know, dignitaries, icons came. Millennium Sunday, King International Chapel on the campus of Morehouse. They put the I Have a Dream speech on the wall. If you go to his chapel at Morehouse, you see the I Have a Dream speech on the outside of the brick wall. And the dean of chapel invited me to come and share before this huge audience of why the I Have a Dream speech is considered to be the greatest speech of the 20th century. And then to be inducted into King Collegium of Scholars, and the King family's there as well. So having a chance to spend time with Mrs. King and others, you know, following the program. And it's just a lot of lifelong memories for me, as well as my wife and my children and, you know, other folks that we met in the process and still, you know, meeting.
One last question.
Hi there. I'm just thinking, I would love to hear you speak about the social gospel in the black church today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we are as engaged in the social gospel as much as Martin Luther King's father was, Daddy King, Benjamin Mays, you know, William Holmes Border, those in the 1940s and 50s. Unfortunately, you know, we're in a day and time where there's an emphasis that's placed on, you know, profiting, making money. It's more of a materialistic kind of gospel, and you know that everybody, you know, can be rich, and you know this sort of power of positive thinking, whereas King and others had you know this sort of not sort of, but actually more of an altruistic kind of faith, this unselfish concern for the welfare of others, to the point that he was willing to make personal sacrifices. I mean, you know, the house that I showed, you know, he didn't want to buy a house. He didn't buy a house till 1965, and he didn't want his name on it. You know, the money that he gets, you know, the $54,000 he gets for winning the Nobel Peace Prize, he gives that, you know, to the SCLC, to the movement. You know, Coretta and the kids needed money. You know, she wanted things. But he, you know, those are the three evils for him: racism, militarism, and materialism. And so when you think about it now, what, you know, in terms of, you know, we are a very materialistic culture. It's about more and more greed. You know, how much am I going to get? You know, who do I have to step over or step around in order to get it? And that just, King didn't live that. You know, I mean, he, you know, he was a doer. I mean, he believed and he was concerned about the poor, and he lived his life like that. He only had just a few suits. You know, when you in the casket, you know, that was his favorite suit. You know, they had black suit. I'll say this, with the King Papers Project, you know, so many other things have happened. I'll say this, two things. I had the privilege of getting to know the two people who spent the last hours with Martin Luther King, getting to know them extremely well. One was Senator Georgia Powers. And Senator Georgia Powers is the woman that spent the last night with King. She's the woman he had an adult affair with. She was with him April 3rd, 1964. And so she's a senator from Kentucky. She's deceased now. And so I had invited her in 1998 to come to the UK to give a talk along with Clay Carson. That's when I first got a chance to know her. But then in 2010, she wanted to do another book. And she wanted me to work with her on that book. And I was busy with this other project, and I couldn't. And I said, but what I will do is I'll do some interviews with you. Now, she's done a ton of interviews. And so she and I, in August of 2010, sat down for 3 days, one-on-one, and the table was open. I could ask any question I wanted to, as intimate as I wanted to. And she trusted me, and may have been because I'm a pastor. And we talked about everything. And those interviews were sealed until her death. She passed about 2 years ago. But I'm grateful that I had that time with her, for her to open up her heart and really share everything that went on behind the scenes on April 3rd, 1964. The second person was Reverend Samuel Billy Cowles, that I had a chance to know, having lived in Memphis. Well, I actually got to know him after living in Memphis. That, you know, I'd taken a class to Memphis. I invited him to speak. I invited him to come to UK and speak. And we had taken some school teachers to Memphis to meet Reverend Cowles. And if you can, there's a documentary, I don't know if you all have it, Witness from Room 306. You definitely want to get that. It won awards. But I'm so glad Reverend Cowles is deceased. I think he died in 2015, I believe. But he did this documentary. And it's him telling the story of April 4th, 1968, because Martin Luther King was going to Reverend Cowles' home for dinner. And so Cowles, the dinner was scheduled for 6 o'clock. Cowles told King that it was 5 o'clock because he knew they would be late, so he wanted to make sure that King was going to be on time. And King found out that, no, you lied. Your wife told me it's 6 o'clock, so Cowles comes over to Lorraine Motel to pick him up. Him and Abernathy and King are in the room laughing, talking. They leave to go outside. King is standing there on the balcony. Cowles says, I take 5 steps, then pie out. And then boom, King's on the ground. And so he talks about that last hour with Martin Luther King, which is just, I mean, it's good in the documentary, but to hear him tell it face to face, it sent chills down the spine of my students.
Thank you so much for doing this. And I know Dr. Smith will be glad to talk to you if you have personal questions afterwards. Thank you for coming.